The Book of the Grotesque by Sherwood Anderson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The writer, an old man with a white mustache, had some difficulty in getting into bed. The windows of the house in which he lived were high, and he wanted to look at the trees when he awoke in the morning. A carpenter came to fix the bed so that it would be on the level with the window. Quite a fuss was made about the matter. The carpenter, who had been a soldier in the Civil War, came into the writer's room and sat down to talk of building a platform for the purpose of raising the bed. The writer had cigars lying about, and the carpenter smoked. For a time the two men talked of the raising of the bed, and then they talked of other things. The soldier got on the subject of the war. The writer, in fact, led him to that subject. The carpenter had once been a prisoner in Andersonville prison and had lost a brother. The brother had died of starvation, and whenever the carpenter got upon that subject, he cried. He, like the old writer, had a white mustache, and when he cried he puckered up his lips and the mustache bobbed up and down. The weeping old man with the cigar in his mouth was ludicrous. The plan the writer had for the raising of his bed was forgotten, and later the carpenter did it in his own way, and the writer, who was past 60, had to help himself with a chair when he went to bed at night. In his bed the writer rolled over on his side and lay quite still. For years he had been beset with notions concerning his heart. He was a hard smoker, and his heart fluttered. The idea had got into his mind that he would sometime die unexpectedly, and always when he got into bed he thought of that. It did not alarm him. The effect, in fact, was quite a special thing and not easily explained. It made him more alive, there in bed, than at any other time. Perfectly still he lay, and his body was old and not of much use any more, but something inside him was altogether young. He was like a pregnant woman, only that the thing inside him was not a baby, but a youth. No, it wasn't a youth, it was a woman, young and wearing a coat of mail like a knight. It is absurd, you see, to try to tell what was inside the old writer as he lay on his high bed and listened to the fluttering of his heart. The thing to get at is what the writer, or the young thing within the writer, was thinking about. The old writer, like all of the people in the world, had got, during his long life, a great many notions in his head. He had once been quite handsome, and a number of women had been in love with him. And then, of course, he had known people, many people, known them in a peculiarly intimate way that was different from the way in which you and I know people. At least, that is what the writer thought, and the thought pleased him. Why quarrel with an old man concerning his thoughts? In the bed, the writer had a dream that was not a dream. As he grew somewhat sleepy but was still conscious, figures began to appear before his eyes. He imagined the young, indescribable thing within himself was driving a long procession of figures before his eyes. You see, the interest in all this lies in the figures that went before the eyes of the writer. They were all grotesques. All of the men and women the writer had ever known had become grotesques. The grotesques were not all horrible. Some were amusing, some almost beautiful, and one, a woman all drawn out of shape, hurt the old man by her grotesqueness. When she passed, he made a noise like a small dog whimpering. Had you come into the room, you might have supposed the old man had unpleasant dreams, or perhaps indigestion. For an hour the procession of grotesques passed before the eyes of the old man, and then, although it was a painful thing to do, he crept out of bed and began to write. Some one of the grotesques had made a deep impression on his mind, and he wanted to describe it. At his desk the writer worked for an hour. In the end he wrote a book which he called the Book of the Grotesque. It was never published, but I saw it once, and it made an indelible impression on my mind. The book had one central thought that is very strange and has always remained with me. By remembering it, I have been able to understand many people and things that I was never able to understand before. The thought was involved, but a simple statement of it would be something like this: that in the beginning, when the world was young, there were a great many thoughts, but no such thing as a truth. Man made the truths himself, and each truth was a composite of a great many vague thoughts. All about in the world were the truths, and they were all beautiful. The old man had listed hundreds of the truths in his book. I will not try to tell you all of them. There was the truth of virginity and the truth of passion, the truth of wealth and of poverty, of thrift and of profligacy, of carelessness and abandon. Hundreds and hundreds were the truths, and they were all beautiful. And then the people came along. Each, as he appeared, snatched up one of the truths, and some who were quite strong snatched up a dozen of them. It was the truths that made the people grotesques. The old man had quite an elaborate theory concerning the matter. It was his notion that the moment one of the people took one of the truths to himself, called it his truth, and tried to live his life by it, he became a grotesque, and the truth he embraced became a falsehood. You can see for yourself how the old man, who had spent all of his life writing and was filled with words, would write hundreds of pages concerning this matter. The subject would become so big in his mind that he himself would be in danger of becoming a grotesque. He didn't, I suppose for the same reason that he never published the book. It was the young thing inside him that saved the old man. Concerning the old carpenter who fixed the bed for the writer, I only mentioned him because he, like many of what are called very common people, became the nearest thing to what is understandable and lovable of all the grotesques in the writer's book. End of The Book of the Grotesque by Sherwood Anderson.
How the Hodja Saved Allah, from Told in the Coffee House by Cyrus Adler and Allan Ramsay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Not far from the famous mosque Bayazid, an old Hodja kept a school, and very skillfully he taught the rising generation the everlasting lesson from the Book of Books. Such knowledge had he of human nature that by a glance at his pupil he could at once tell how long it would take him to learn a quarter of the Crln. He was known over the whole empire as the best reciter and imparter of the sacred writings of the Prophet. For many years this Hodja, famed far and wide as the Hodja of Hodjas, had taught in his little school. The number of times he had recited the book with his pupils is beyond counting, and should we attempt to consider how often he must have corrected them for some misplaced word, our beards would grow grey in the endeavour. swaying to and fro one day as fast as his old age would let him, and reciting to his pupils the latter part of one of the chapters, Bakkara, divine inspiration opened his inward eye and led him to pause at the following sentence: "And he that spends his money in the ways of Allah is likened unto a grain of wheat that brings forth 7 sheaves, and in each sheaf 100 grains, and Allah giveth twofold unto whom He pleaseth." As his pupils, one after the other, recited this verse to him, he wondered why he had overlooked its meaning for so many years. Fully convinced that anything either given to Allah, or in the way that He proposes, was an investment that brought a percentage undreamt of in known commerce, he dismissed his pupils, and putting his hand into his bosom, drew forth from the many folds of his dress a bag, and proceeded to count his worldly possessions. Carefully and attentively he counted and then recounted his money, and found that if invested in the ways of Allah, it would bring a return of no less than 1,000 piastres. "Think of it," said the Hodja to himself, 1,000 piastres! 1,000 piastres, mashallah! A fortune! So having dismissed his school, he sallied forth, his bag of money in his hand, and began distributing its contents to the needy that he met in the highways. Ere many hours had passed, the whole of his savings was gone. The Hodja was very happy, for now he was the creditor in Allah's books for 1,000 piastres. He returned to his house and ate his evening meal of bread and olives, and was content. The next day came. The 1,000 piastres had not yet arrived. He ate his bread, and he imagined he had olives, and was content. The third day came. The old Hodja had no bread, and he had no olives. He suffered the pangs of hunger. So when the end of the day had come, and his pupils had departed to their homes, the Hodja, with a full heart and an empty stomach, walked out of the town, and soon got beyond the city walls. There, where no one could hear him, he lamented his sad fate, and the great calamity that had befallen him in his old age. What sin had he committed, what great wrong had his ancestors done, that the wrath of the Almighty had thus fallen on him, when his earthly course was well nigh run? "Ya Allah, Allah!" he cried, and beat his breast. As if in answer to his cry, the howl of the dreaded Fakir Dervish came over across the plain. In those days the Fakir Dervish was a terror in the land. He knocked at the door, and it was opened. He asked, and received food. If refused, life often paid the penalty. The Hodja's lamentations were now greater than ever, for should the Dervish ask him for food, and the Hodja have nothing to give, he would certainly be killed. "Allah, Allah, Allah, guide me now! Protect one of your faithful followers!" cried the frightened Hodja, and he looked around to see if there was anyone to rescue him from his perilous position. But not a soul was to be seen, and the walls of the city were 5 miles distant. Just then the howl of the Dervish again reached his ear, and in terror he flew, he knew not whither. As luck would have it, he came upon a tree, up which, although stiff from age and weak from want, the Hodja, with wonderful agility, scrambled and, trembling like a leaf, awaited his fate. Nearer and nearer came the howling Dervish, till at last his long hair could be seen floating in the air, as with rapid strides he preceded the wind upon his endless journey. On and on he came, his wild yell sending the blood from very fear to unknown parts of the poor Hodja's body, and leaving his face as yellow as a melon. To his utter dismay, the Hodja saw the Dervish approach the tree and sit down under its shade. Sighing deeply, the Dervish said in a loud voice, "Why have I come to this world? Why were my forefathers born? Why was anybody born? O Allah, O Allah, what have you done? Misery, Misery, nothing but misery to all mankind and everything living. Shall I not be avenged for all the misery my father and my father's fathers have suffered? I shall be avenged." Striking his chest a loud blow, as if to emphasize the decision he had come to, the dervish took a small bag that lay by his side, and slowly proceeded to untie the leather strings that bound it. Bringing forth from it a small image, he gazed at it a moment, and then addressing it in the following terms: "You, Job, you bore much, you have written a book in which your history is recorded, you have earned the reputation of being the most patient man that ever lived, yet I have read your history and found that when real affliction oppressed you, you cursed God. You have made men believe, too, that there is a reward in this life for all the afflictions they suffer. You have misled mankind. For these sins no one has ever punished you. Now I will punish you." And taking his long curved sword in his hand, he cut off the head of the figure. The dervish bent forward, took another image, and, gazing upon it with a contemptuous smile, thus addressed it: "David, David, singer of songs of peace in this world and in the world to come. I have read your sayings in which you counsel men to lead a righteous life for the sake of the reward which they are to receive. I have learned that you have misled your fellow mortals with your songs of peace and joy. I have read your history, and I find that you have committed many sins. For these sins and for misleading your fellow men you have never been punished. Now I will punish you." And taking a sword in his hand, he cut off David's head. Again the dervish bent forward and brought forth an image which he addressed as follows: "You, Solomon, are reputed to have been the wisest man that ever lived. You had command over the host of the genii, and could control the legion of the demons. They came at the bidding of your signet ring, and they trembled at the mysterious names to which you gave utterance. You understood every living thing. The speech of the beasts of the field, and the birds of the air, of the insects of the earth, and of the fishes of the sea, was known unto you. Yet, when I read your history, I found that in spite of the vast knowledge that was vouchsafed unto you, you committed many wrongs and did many foolish things, which in the end brought misery into the world, and destruction unto your people, and for all these no one has ever punished you. Now I will punish you." And taking his sword, he cut off Solomon's head. Again the dervish bent forward and brought forth from the bag another figure, which he addressed thus: "Jesus, Jesus, prophet of God, you came into this world to atone, by giving your blood, for the sins of mankind, and to bring unto them a religion of peace. You founded a church whose history I have studied, and I see that it sets fathers against their children and brethren against one another, that it brought strife into the world, that the lives of men and women and children were sacrificed, so that the rivers ran red with blood unto the seas. Truly, you were a great prophet, but the misery you caused must be avenged. For it no one has yet punished you. Now I will punish you." And he took his sword and cut off Jesus' head. With a sorrowful face, the dervish bent forward and brought forth another image from the bag. "Mohammed," he said, "I have slain Job, David, Solomon, and Jesus. What shall I do with you? After the followers of Jesus had shed much blood, their religion spread over the world, was acceptable unto men, and the nations were at peace. Then you came into the world, and you brought a new religion, and father rose against son, and brother rose against brother. Hatred was sown between your followers and the followers of Jesus, and again the rivers ran red with blood unto the seas, and you have not been punished. For this I will punish you, by the beard of my forefathers, whose blood was made to flow in your cause. You must die." And with a blow the head of Mohammed fell to the ground. Then the dervish prostrated himself to the earth, and after a silent prayer rose and brought forth from the bag the last figure. Reverently he bowed to it, and then he addressed it as follows: "O Allah, the Allah of Allahs, there's but one Allah, and thou art He. I have slain Job, David, Solomon, Jesus, and Mohammed for the folly that they have brought into the world. Thou, God, art all-powerful. All men are thy children, thou createst them and bringest them into the world. The thoughts that they think are thy thoughts. If all these men have brought this evil into the world, it is thy fault. Shall I punish them and allow thee to go unhurt? No, I must punish thee also." And he raised his sword to strike. As the sword circled in the air, the Hodja, secreted in the tree, forgot the fear in which he stood of the dervish. In the excitement of the moment he cried out in a loud tone of voice, "Stop! Stop! He owes me 1,000 piastres!" The dervish reeled and fell senseless to the ground. The Hodja was overcome at his own words, and trembled with fear, convinced that his last hour had arrived. The dervish lay stretched upon his back on the grass, like one dead. At last the Hodja took courage. Breaking a twig from off the tree, he threw it down upon the dervish's face, but the dervish made no sign. The Hodja took more courage, removed one of his heavy outer shoes, and threw it on the outstretched figure of the dervish, but still the dervish lay motionless. The Hodja carefully climbed down the tree, gave the body of the dervish a kick, and climbed back again, and still the dervish did not stir. At length the Hodja descended from the tree and placed his ear to the dervish's heart. It did not beat. The dervish was dead. "Ah well," said the Hodja, "at least I shall not starve. I will take his garments and sell them and buy me some bread." The Hodja commenced to remove the dervish's garments. As he took off his belt he found that it was heavy. He opened it and saw that it contained gold. He counted the gold and found that it was exactly 1,000 piastres. The Hodja turned his face toward Mecca and raising his eyes to heaven said, "O God, you have kept your promise, but," he added, "not before I saved your life." End of How the Hodja Saved Allah by Cyrus Adler and Allan Ramsay.
Circumstance by Harriet Prescott Spofford. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. She had remained, during all that day, with a sick neighbor. Those eastern wilds of Maine in that epoch frequently making neighbors and miles synonymous, and so busy had she been with care and sympathy that she did not at first observe the approaching night. But finally the level rays, reddening the snow, threw their gleam upon the wall, and hastily donning her cloak and hood, she bade her friends farewell, and sallied forth on her return. Home lay some 3 miles distant, across a copse, a meadow, and a piece of woods, the woods being a fringe on the skirts of the great forests that stretch far away into the north. That home was one of a dozen log houses lying a few furlongs apart from each other, with their half-cleared domains separating them at the rear from a wilderness untrodden save by stealthy native or deadly panther tribes. She was in a nowise exalted frame of spirit; on the contrary, rather depressed by the pain she had witnessed and the fatigue she had endured; but in certain temperaments such a condition throws open the mental pores, so to speak, and renders one receptive of every influence. Through the little copse she walked slowly, with her cloak folded about her, lingering to imbibe the sense of shelter, the sunset filtered in purple through the mist of woven spray and twig, the companionship of growth not sufficiently dense to band against her, the sweet home feeling of a young and tender wintry wood. It was therefore just on the edge of the evening that she emerged from the place and began to cross the meadowland. At one hand lay the forest to which her path wound. At the other the evening star hung over a tide of falling orange that slowly slipped down the earth's broad side to sadden other hemispheres with sweet regret. Walking rapidly now, and with her eyes wide open, she distinctly saw in the air before her what was not there a moment ago, a winding sheet, cold, white, and ghastly, waved by the likeness of four wan hands, that rose with a long inflation and fell in rigid folds, while a voice, shaping itself from the hollowness above, spectral and melancholy, sighed, "The Lord have mercy on the people! The Lord have mercy on the people!" 3 times the sheet with its corpse-covering outline waved beneath the pale hands, and the voice, awful in its solemn and mysterious depth, sighed, "The Lord have mercy on the people!" When all was gone, the place was clear again, the gray sky was obstructed by no deathly blot. She looked about her, shook her shoulders decidedly, and, pulling on her hood, went forward once more. She might have been a little frightened by such an apparition if she had led a life of less reality than frontier settlers are apt to lead, but dealing with hard fact does not engender a flimsy habit of mind, and this woman was too sincere and earnest in her character, and too happy in her situation, to be thrown by antagonism merely upon superstitious fancies and chimeras of the second sight. She did not even believe herself subject to an hallucination, but smiled simply, a little vexed that her thought could have framed such a glamour from the day's occurrences, and not sorry to lift the bough of the warder of the woods and enter and disappear in their somber path. If she had been imaginative, she would have hesitated at her first step into a region whose dangers were not visionary. But I suppose that the thought of a little child at home would conquer that propensity in the most habituated. So, biting a bit of spicy birch, she went along. Now and then she came to a gap where the trees had been partially felled, and here she found that the lingering twilight was explained by that peculiar and perhaps electric film which sometimes sheathes the sky in diffused light for many hours before a brilliant aurora. Suddenly a swift shadow, like a fabulous flying dragon, writhed through the air before her, and she felt herself instantly seized and borne aloft. It was that wild beast, the most savage and serpentine and subtle and fearless of our latitudes, known by hunters as the Indian devil, and he held her in his clutches on the broad floor of a swinging fir bough. His long sharp claws were caught in her clothing; he worried them sagaciously a little, then, finding that ineffectual to free them, he commenced licking her bare arm with his rasping tongue, and pouring over her the wide streams of his hot, fetid breath. So quick had this flashing action been, that the woman had had no time for alarm. Moreover, she was not of the screaming kind. But now, as she felt him endeavoring to disentangle his claws, and the horrid sense of her fate smote her, and she saw instinctively the fierce plunge of those weapons, the long strips of living flesh torn from her bones, the agony, the quivering disgust, itself a worse agony, while by her side and holding her in his great lithe embrace the monster crouched, his white tusks whetting and gnashing, his eyes glaring through all the darkness like balls of red fire, a shriek that rang in every forest hollow, that startled every winter-housed thing, that stirred and woke the least needle of the tasselled pines, tore through her lips. A moment afterward the beast left the arm, once white, now crimson, and looked up alertly. She did not think at this instant to call upon God. She called upon her husband. It seemed to her that she had but one friend in the world; that was he; and again the cry, loud, clear, prolonged, echoed through the woods. It was not the shriek that disturbed the creature at his relish. He was not born in the woods to be scared of an owl, you know. What then? It must have been the echo, most musical, most resonant, repeated and yet repeated, dying with long sighs of sweet sound, vibrated from rock to river and back again from depth to depth of cave and cliff. Her thought flew after it. She knew that, even if her husband heard it, he yet could not reach her in time. She saw that while the beast listened he would not gnaw; and this she felt directly, when the rough, sharp, and multiplied stings of his tongue retouched her arm. Again her lips opened by instinct, but the sound that issued thence came by reason. She had heard that music charmed wild beasts. Just this point between life and death intensified every faculty, and when she opened her lips the third time, it was not for shrieking, but for singing. A little thread of melody stole out, a rill of tremulous motion. It was the cradle song with which she rocked her baby. How could she sing that? And then she remembered the baby sleeping rosily in the long settee before the fire, the father cleaning his gun, with one foot on the green wooden rundle, the merry light from the chimney dancing out and through the room, on the rafters of the ceiling with their tassels of onions and herbs, on the log walls painted with lichens and festooned with apples, on the king's arm slung across the shelf with the old pirate's cutlass, on the snow pile of the bed, and on the great brass clock; dancing too, and lingering on the baby, with his fringed gentian eyes, his chubby fists clenched on the pillow, and his fine breezy hair fanning with the motion of his father's foot. All this struck her in one, and made her sob of her breath, and she ceased. Immediately the long red tongue thrust forth again. Before it touched, a song sprang to her lips, a wild sea song, such as some sailor might be singing far out on trackless blue water that night, the shrouds whistling with frost and the sheets glued in ice; a song with the wind in its burden and the spray in its chorus. The monster raised his head and flared the fiery eyeballs upon her, then fretted the imprisoned claws a moment and was quiet. Only the breath like the vapor from some hell pit still swathed her. Her voice, at first faint and fearful, gradually lost its quaver, grew under her control and subject to her modulation. It rose on long swells, it fell in subtle cadences, now and then its tones pealed out like bells from distant belfries on fresh sonorous mornings. She sung the song through, and, wondering lest his name of Indian devil were not his true name, and if he would not detect her, she repeated it. Once or twice now, indeed, the beast stirred uneasily, turned, and made the bough sway with his movement. As she ended, he snapped his jaws together and tore away the fettered member, curling it under him with a snarl. When she burst into the gayest reel that ever answered a fiddle bow. How many a time had she heard her husband play it on the homely fiddle made by himself from birch and cherry wood? How many a time had she seen it danced on the floor of their one room, to the patter of wooden clogs and the rustle of homespun petticoat? How many a time had she danced it herself? And did she not remember once, as they joined clasps for 8 hands round, how it had lent its gay, bright measure to her life? And here she was singing it alone in the forest at midnight to a wild beast. As she sent her voice trilling up and down its quick oscillations between joy and pain, the creature who grasped her uncurled his paw and scratched the bark from the bough. She must vary the spell. And her voice spun, leaping along the projecting points of tune of a hornpipe. Still singing, she felt herself twisted about with a low growl, and a lifting of the red lip from the glittering teeth. She broke the hornpipe's thread and commenced unraveling a lighter, livelier thing, an Irish jig. Up and down and round about her voice flew, the beast threw back his head so that the diabolical face fronted hers, and the torrent of his breath prepared her for his feast as the anaconda slimes his prey. Frantically she darted from tune to tune; his restless movements followed her. She tired herself with dancing and vivid national airs, growing feverish and singing spasmodically as she felt her horrid tomb yawning wider. Touching in this manner all the slogan and keen clan cries, the beast moved again, but only to lay the disengaged paw across her with heavy satisfaction. She did not dare to pause. Through the clear cold air, the frosty starlight, she sang. If there were yet any tremor in the tone, it was not fear. She had learned the secret of sound at last. Nor could it be chill, far too high a fever throbbed her pulses. It was nothing but the thought of the log house and of what might be passing within it. She fancied the baby stirring in his sleep and moving his pretty lips, her husband rising and opening the door, looking out after her, and wondering at her absence. She fancied the light pouring through the chink, and then shut in again with all the safety and comfort and joy, her husband taking down the fiddle and playing lightly with his head inclined, playing while she sang for her life to an Indian devil. Then she knew he was fumbling for and finding some shining fragment and scoring it down the yellowing hair, and unconsciously her voice forsook the wild war tunes and drifted into the half gay, half melancholy Rosin the Bow. Suddenly she woke pierced with a pang, and the daggered tooth penetrating her flesh. Dreaming of safety, she had ceased singing and lost it. The beast had regained the use of all his limbs, and now, standing and raising his back, bristling and foaming, with sounds that would have been like hisses but for their deep and fearful sonority, he withdrew step by step toward the trunk of the tree, still with his flaming balls upon her. She was all at once free, on one end of the bough 20 feet from the ground. She did not measure the distance, but rose to drop herself down, careless of any death, so that it were not this. Instantly, as if he scanned her thoughts, the creature bounded forward with a yell and caught her again in his dreadful hold. It might be that he was not greatly famished; for, as she suddenly flung up her voice again, he settled himself composedly on the bough, still clasping her with invincible pressure to his rough, ravenous breast, and listening in a fascination to the sad, strange "Ulalu" that now moaned forth in loud, hollow tones above him. He half closed his eyes, and sleepily reopened and shut them again. What rending pains were close at hand! Death, and what a death! Worse than any other that is to be named. Water, be it cold or warm, that which buoys up blue ice fields, or which bathes tropical coasts with currents of balmy bliss, is yet a gentle conqueror, kisses as it kills, and draws you down gently through darkening fathoms to its heart. Death at the sword is the festival of trumpet and bugle and banner, with glory ringing out around you, and distant hearts thrilling through yours. No gnawing disease can bring such hideous end as this, for it is a fiend bred of your own flesh; and this, is it a fiend, this living lump of appetites? What dread comes with the thought of perishing in flames? Yet fire, let it leap and hiss never so hotly, is something too remote, too alien, to inspire us with such loathly horror as a wild beast. If it have a life, that life is too utterly beyond our comprehension. Fire is not half ourselves; as it devours, arouses neither hatred nor disgust; is not to be known by the strength of our lower natures let loose; does not drip our blood into our faces from foaming chaps, nor mouth nor slaver above us with vitality. Let us be ended by fire, and we are ashes, for the winds to bear, the leaves to cover. Let us be ended by wild beasts, and the base, cursed thing howls with us forever through the forest. All this she felt as she charmed him, and what force it lent to her song God knows. If her voice should fail! If the damp and cold should give her any fatal hoarseness! If all the silent powers of the forest did not conspire to help her! The dark, hollow night rose indifferently over her; the wild, cold air breathed rudely past her, lifted her wet hair and blew it down again. The great boughs swung with a ponderous strength, now and then clashed their iron lengths together and shook off a sparkle of icy spears or some long laid weight of snow from their heavy shadows. The green depths were utterly cold and silent and stern. These beautiful haunts, that all the summer were hers and rejoiced to share with her their bounty, these heavens that had yielded their largesse, these stems that had thrust their blossoms into her hands, all these friends of 3 moons ago forgot her now and knew her no longer. Feeling her desolation, wild, melancholy, forsaken songs rose thereon from that frightful eyrie. Weeping, wailing tunes that sob among people from age to age, and overflow with otherwise unexpressed sadness, all rude, mournful ballads, old tearful strains that Shakespeare heard the vagrants sing, and that rise and fall like the wind and tide, sailors' songs to be heard only in lone mid-watches, beneath the moon and stars, ghastly rhyming romances such as that famous one of Lady Margaret when she slipped on her gown of green, a piece below the knee, and 'twas all a long, cold winter's night, a dead corse followed she. Still the beast lay with closed eyes, yet never relaxing his grasp. Once a half whine of enjoyment escaped him. He fawned his fearful head upon her. Once he scored her cheek with his tongue, savage caresses that hurt like wounds. How weary she was, and yet how terribly awake! How fuller and fuller of dismay grew the knowledge that she was only prolonging her anguish and playing with death! How appalling the thought that with her voice ceased her existence! Yet she could not sing forever. Her throat was dry and hard. Her very breath was a pain. Her mouth was hotter than any desert-worn pilgrim's. If she could but drop upon her burning tongue one atom of the ice that glittered about her! But both of her arms were pinioned in the giant's vice. She remembered the winding sheet, and for the first time in her life shivered with spiritual fear. Was it hers? She asked herself as she sang what sins she had committed, what life she had led, to find her punishment so soon and in these pangs. And then she thought eagerly for some reason why her husband was not up and abroad to find her. He failed her, her one sole hope in life; and without being aware of it, her voice forsook the songs of suffering and sorrow for old covenanting hymns, hymns with which her mother had lulled her, which the class leader pitched in the chimney corners, grand and sweet Methodist hymns, brimming with melody, and with all fantastic involutions of tune to suit that ecstatic worship; hymns full of the beauty of holiness, steadfast, relying, sanctified by the salvation they had lent to those in worse extremity than hers; for they had found themselves in the grasp of hell, while she was but in the jaws of death. Out of this strange music, peculiar to one character of faith, and than which there is none more beautiful in its degree, nor owning a more potent sway of sound, her voice soared into the glorified chants of churches. What to her was death by cold, or famine, or wild beasts? "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him," she sang. High and clear through the frore fair night, the level moonbeams splintering in the wood, the scarce glints of stars in the shadowy roof of branches, those sacred anthems rose as a hope from despair, as some snowy spray of flower bells from blackest mold. Was she not in God's hands? Did not the world swing at his will? If this were his great plan of providence, was it not best, and should she not accept it? "He is the Lord our God, his judgments are in all the earth." Oh, sublime faith of our fathers, where utter self-sacrifice alone was true love, the fragrance of whose unrequited subjection was pleasanter than that of golden censers swung in purple vapored chancels. Never ceasing in the rhythm of her thoughts, articulated in music as they thronged, the memory of her first communion flashed over her. Again she was in that distant place on that sweet spring morning. Again the congregation rustled out, and the few remained, and she trembled to find herself among them. How well she remembered the devout, quiet faces, too accustomed to the sacred feast to glow with their inner joy! How well the snowy linen at the altar, the silver vessels slowly and silently shifting! And as the cup approached and passed, how the sense of delicious perfume stole in and heightened the transport of her prayer, and she had seemed, looking up through the windows where the sky soared blue in constant freshness, to feel all heaven's balms dripping from the portals, and to scent the lilies of eternal peace. Perhaps another would not have felt so much ecstasy as satisfaction on that occasion. but it is a true, if a later disciple, who has said, "The Lord bestoweth his blessings there, where he findeth the vessels empty." "And does it need the walls of a church to renew my communion?" she asked. "Does not every moment stand a temple foursquare to God? And in that morning, with its buoyant sunlight, was I any dearer to the heart of the world than now? My beloved is mine, and I am his," she sang over and over again, with all varied inflection and profuse tune. How gently all the winter wrapped things bent toward her then! Into what relation with her had they grown? How this common dependence was the spell of their intimacy! How at one with nature had she become! How all the night and the silence and the forest seemed to hold its breath, and to send its soul up to God in her singing! It was no longer despondency, that singing; it was neither prayer nor petition. She had left imploring, "How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death; for in death there is no remembrance of thee," with countless other such fragments of supplication. She cried rather, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me," and lingered and repeated and sang again, "I shall be satisfied when I awake with thy likeness." Then she thought of the great deliverance, when he drew her up out of many waters, and the flashing old psalm pealed forth triumphantly: "The Lord descended from above, and bode the heavens high, and underneath his feet he cast the darkness of the sky. On cherubs and on cherubims full royally he rode, and on the wings of all the winds came flying all abroad." She forgot how recently, and with what a strange pity for her own shapeless form that was to be, she had quaintly sung, "O lovely appearance of death! What sight upon earth is so fair? Not all the gay pageants that breathe Can with a dead body compare." She remembered instead, "In thy presence is fullness of joy; at thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. God will redeem my soul from the power of the grave, for he shall receive me. He will swallow up death in victory." Not once now did she say, "Lord, how long wilt thou look on? Rescue my soul from their destructions, my darling from the lions." For she knew that the young lions roar after their prey and seek their meat from God. "O Lord, thou preservest man and beast," she said. She had no comfort or consolation in this season, such as sustained the Christian martyrs in the amphitheatre. She was not dying for her faith. There were no palms in heaven for her to wave. But how many a time had she declared, "I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness." And as the broad rays here and there broke through the dense covert of shade and lay in rivers of lustre on crystal sheathing and broken fretting of trunk and limb and on the great spaces of refraction, they builded up visibly that house, the shining city on the hill, and singing, "Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, on the sides of the north, the city of the great King," her vision climbed to that higher picture where the angel shows the dazzling thing, the holy Jerusalem descending out of heaven from God, with its splendid battlements and gates of pearls, and its foundations, the 11th a jacinth, the 12th an amethyst, with its great white throne and the rainbow round about it, in sight like unto an emerald. "And there shall be no night there, for the Lord God giveth them light," she sang. What whisper of dawn now rustled through the wilderness? How the night was passing! And still the beast crouched upon the bough, changing only the posture of his head, that again he might command her with those charmed eyes. Half their fire was gone. She could almost have released herself from his custody. Yet, had she stirred, no one knows what malevolent instinct might have dominated anew. But of that she did not dream. Long ago stripped of any expectation, she was experiencing in her divine rapture how mystically true it is that "he that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty." Slow clarion cries now wound from the distance as the cocks caught the intelligence of day and re-echoed it faintly from farm to farm; sleepy sentinels of night sounding the foe's invasion and translating that dim intuition to ringing tones of warning. Still she chanted on. A remote crash of brushwood told of some other beast on his depredations, or some night-belated traveler groping his way through the narrow path. Still she chanted on. The far, faint echoes of the chanticleers died into distance. The crashing of the branches grew nearer. No wild beast that, but a man's step, a man's form in the moonlight, stalwart and strong. On one arm slept a little child, in the other hand he held his gun. Still she chanted on. Perhaps, when her husband last looked forth, he was half ashamed to find what a fear he felt for her. He knew she would never leave the child so long but for some direst need. And yet he may have laughed at himself as he lifted it and wrapped it with awkward care, and loading his gun and strapping on his horn, opened the door again and closed it behind him, going out and plunging into the darkness and dangers of the forest. He was more singularly alarmed than he would have been willing to acknowledge. As he had sat with his bow hovering over the strings, he had half believed to hear her voice mingling gaily with the instrument, till he paused and listened if she were not about to lift the latch and enter. As he drew nearer the heart of the forest, that intimation of melody seemed to grow more actual, to take body and breath, to come and go on long swells and ebbs of the night breeze, to increase with tune and words, till a strange shrill singing grew ever clearer; and as he stepped into an open space of moonbeams, far up in the branches, rocked by the wind, and singing, "How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him that bringeth good tidings, that publisheth peace," he saw his wife. His wife. But, great God in heaven, how? Some mad exclamation escaped him, but without diverting her. The child knew the singing voice, though never heard it before in that unearthly key, and turned toward it through the veiling dreams. With a celerity almost instantaneous, it lay, in the twinkling of an eye, on the ground at the father's feet, while his gun he raised to his shoulder and levelled at the monster covering his wife with shaggy form and flaming gaze. His wife so ghastly white, so rigid, so stained with blood, her eyes so fixedly bent above, and her lips, that had indurated into the chiselled pallor of marble, parted only with that flood of solemn song. I do not know if it were the mother instinct that for a moment lowered her eyes, those eyes so lately riveted on heaven, now suddenly seeing all lifelong bliss possible. A thrill of joy pierced and shivered through her like a weapon, her voice trembled in its course, her glance lost its steady strength, fever flushes chased each other over her face, yet she never once ceased chanting. She was quite aware that, if her husband shot now, the ball must pierce her body before reaching any vital part of the beast; and yet better that death, by his hand, than the other. But this her husband also knew, and he remained motionless, just covering the creature with the sight. He dared not fire, lest some wound not mortal should break the spell exercised by her voice, and the beast, enraged with pain, should rend her in atoms. Moreover, the light was too uncertain for his aim. So he waited. Now and then he examined his gun to see if the damp were injuring its charge, now and then he wiped the great drops from his forehead. Again the cocks crowed with the passing hour, the last time they were heard on that night. Cheerful home sound then, how full of safety and all comfort and rest it seemed! What sweet morning incidents of sparkling fire and sunshine, of gay household bustle, shining dresser, and cooing baby, of steaming cattle in the yard and brimming milk pails at the door! What pleasant voices! What laughter! What security! And here... Now, as she sang on in the slow, endless, infinite moments, the fervent vision of God's peace was gone. Just as the grave had lost its sting, she was snatched back again into the arms of earthly hope. In vain she tried to sing, "There remaineth a rest for the people of God." Her eyes trembled on her husband's, and she could only think of him and of the child, and of happiness that might yet be, but with what a dreadful gulf of doubt between! She shuddered now in the suspense; all calm forsook her; she was tortured with dissolving heats or frozen with icy blasts; her face contracted, growing small and pinched; her voice was hoarse and sharp, every tone cut like a knife; the notes became heavy to lift; withheld by some hostile pressure; impossible. One gasp, a convulsive effort, and there was silence. She had lost her voice. The beast made a sluggish movement, stretched and fawned like one awakening; then, as if he would have yet more of the enchantment, stirred her slightly with his muzzle. As he did so, a sidelong hint of the man standing below with the raised gun smote him. He sprung round furiously, and, seizing his prey, was about to leap into some unknown airy den of the topmost branches now waving to the slow dawn. The late moon had rounded through the sky, so that her gleam at last fell full upon the bough with fairy frosting. The wintry morning light did not yet penetrate the gloom. The woman, suspended in mid-air an instant, cast only one agonized glance beneath, but across and through it, ere the lids could fall, shot a withering sheet of flame. A rifle crack, half heard, was lost in the terrible yell of desperation that bounded after it and filled her ears with savage echoes, and in the wide arc of some eternal descent she was falling. But the beast fell under her. I think that the moment following must have been too sacred for us, and perhaps the three have no special interest again till they issue from the shadows of the wilderness upon the white hills that skirt their home. The father carries the child hushed again into slumber; the mother follows with no such feeble step as might be anticipated. It is not time for reaction; the tension not yet relaxed, the nerves still vibrant, she seems to herself like some one newly made. The night was a dream; the present stamped upon her in deep satisfaction, neither weighed nor compared with the past. If she has the careful tricks of former habit, it is as an automaton. And as they slowly climb the steep under the clear gray vault and the paling morning star, and as she stops to gather a spray of the red roseberries or a feathery tuft of dead grasses for the chimney piece of the log house, or a handful of brown cones for the child's play, of these quiet, happy folk you could scarcely dream how lately they had stolen from under the banner and encampment of the great king Death. The husband proceeds a step or two in advance; the wife lingers over a singular footprint in the snow, stoops and examines it, then looks up with a hurried word. Her husband stands alone on the hill, his arms folded across the babe, his gun fallen; stands defined as a silhouette against the pallid sky. What is there in their home, lying below and yellowing in the light, to fix him with such a stare? She springs to his side. There is no home there! The log house, the barns, the neighboring farms, the fences, are all blotted out and mingled in one smoking ruin. Desolation and death were indeed there, and beneficence and life in the forest. Tomahawk and scalping knife, descending during that night, had left behind them only this work of their accomplished hatred, and one subtle footprint in the snow. For the rest, the world was all before them, where to choose. End of Circumstance, by Harriet Prescott Spofford. Read by TriciaG.